Hi everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome back and introduce our former colleague Jacek Gwizdka, who is now at the University of Texas at Austin, the Information School, where he leads is co-director of the Information Experience Lab. Jacek has a master's degree from Łódź Polytechnic University in electrical engineering, did some computer science work there, went back on to the University of Toronto, did his PhD in industrial engineering, which amounted there to human-computer interaction under the direction of Mark Gignani. After doing his PhD, he did a postdoc in Toronto in the Department of Psychology, where he began his work on personal information management, I think, and the email in particular. He's since been a leader in applying and understanding people applying to interaction of information theories and methods from psychology, human-computer interaction, and most recently from Neuro-Physiological evidence about the people's interactions with information. And that's what he's going to talk about today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for a lovely introduction. It's a strange feeling to be in this room. It seems to be a little bit upside down. I mean,
yes, turn it around. Turn it around.
I hope I will not start from the end of my talk. Right, so I'm in Texas now. And however, as you will see, a good part of what I'm going to talk about started here because the data collection for some of these studies started when I was here. So many of us are trying to gain better understanding of search behaviors. And this historically amounted largely to studying observing behavior. And when we wanted to ask questions of why this happens, we talk to people, we interview them, we survey them. And we can learn only as much from this kind of data collection methods. They are subjective, they are subject to response bias. And moreover, not everything is expressible because people may not even be aware what they are looking at or what kind of information they have seen or they have not seen. And moreover, in our quest for understanding search behavior, there was so far relatively little attention paid to psychophysiological states. But they do matter. There is it's a kind of a two-way interaction. So a person may be in a certain state, cognitively or affectively speaking, and this affects how this person interacts. And so we should take it into account to better understand what's going on. But also there's the other direction, that a better or worse interface and information overload on the web page will lead to cognitive, increased cognitive load, for example. So it really is important to also pay attention to these factors. And in order to understand them, to better and then understand search, wouldn't be nice if we could peek into a person's brain to see what's going on. And before we can do it literally, if ever, that's when the computers will take over our world. There is a range of methods, which I collectively called NP for Neuro-Physiological methods, that allow us to gain certain insights into persons' cognitive or affective states. And they include eye tracking, EEG, and fMRI. These are probably the three most commonly used, and these are the methods that I'm going to talk about today. And more specifically, so I'm going to talk briefly about these three methods while I'm presenting some of my research. So I will say some specifics of these methods. The focus of how the experiments were focused and designed is on correlating neurophysiological data with information relevance. And I'm going to talk about a study that involved fMRI, eye tracking, and EEG, and they are all static text documents. And then I'm also going to talk about a study that included eye tracking on web pages. And I'm going to close with some challenges and opportunities in applying NP methods in information search behavior studies. So there's actually quite a few things that I would like to share with you. Luckily, the first three data analysis items that I would like to talk about, they share pretty much the same, almost exactly the same experimental design. Which this happened here. So this was in a collaboration with Dr. Michael Koch.
Yeah, doctor.
and also Michael was heavily involved in data collection. So the experimental design. So the design was mixed design with two blocks, where the two blocks were defined by types of tasks. There was one very simple task that was a visual search for a target word on a screen full of text, a paragraph long text. And it was just find a word, and then press yes or no. The second task was information search task. And here the task was to find whether a text presented on screen contained answer to a question that was presented earlier to a person. And the questions were kind of like fact-finding. I will give you an example a little bit later. There were 21 trials, and each contained a question and 3 documents at varying levels of relevance. From relevant through topical, but not containing an answer to the question, to irrelevant. And the order was pseudo-randomized to make sure that people cannot guess actually what kind of document is coming as the next. Right, and so in some of them, it was defined where the relevant information was contained. And this timeline shows you actually how many seconds were per each trial. This was important especially for the fMRI study, that the times were set specifically. And the time on the actual texts was up to 20 seconds, which was sufficient to read these documents. And on the, well, I don't remember what actually on the average, but the minimum time people took was something like 8 seconds. So they took between 8 seconds to 20 seconds to read and decide on these documents. Here is one example of a question. The documents came from a quaint data set, which is a set of news stories that was used, for example, at a track conference in the question and answer track. And this is where we got the initial relevance ratings. So here's an example of a question, and then there were 3 documents presented, and one of them contained the specific answer, the other one was totally on something else, and then there was something on the same topic, but without the answer being present. All right. So, and the first study I'm going to talk about is a study that involved using fMRI that was done in Newark at the Rubik Center with Michael, as I mentioned. Overall, we ran something like 18 people. We ran hard lessons. It's hard to do this. So out of those, only 8 they were primary students yielded usable data. It was a within-subject design, as I just explained, and we were interested in binary relevance judgments from people. Yeah, and one tidbit here is that I presented it at Neuro-IS, which stands for Neuro Information Systems Conference, and they liked it, and they awarded the most visionary paper award for this. So, a few words about fMRI. So fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, is based on something called VOLT, which is blood oxygenation level dependent signal. So the idea is that if a brain area is activated more, if we think more intensely, then there's a more freshly oxygenated blood flowing through this area. And the magnetic properties of oxygenated blood are different than deoxygenated blood, and this can be measured in these powerful, very expensive machines. So it's excellent because it allows for precise location of activity. However, there is still some dispute, what are these machines really measuring? The method is about 20 years old, and there was a lot of hooray, and we will understand everything, but it's not so simple, it turns out. The other reason why it's not so simple is that now we understand it's not just one brain area that's responsible for some activity, but it's most likely like networks of areas, and also it's not just a static activity, but it's activity that takes course over time. But still, it gives us some idea. We can get some sense of what's going on, let's say. Another disadvantage is very poor temporally, so you cannot really observe quick reactions to information, to images. It takes seconds for the signal to actually start peaking. It's very difficult to be in this tube for something like even half an hour. It's noisy. You lie down. But before we have something else that's it's available technique. One other important danger here is that some people are guilty of, and I'm trying to avoid it, is that if we find that we design tasks to involve executive function, executive control, or some other specific function, and we know, and then there's a specific area of brain, let's say it's medial frontal gyrus, which is activated according to our fMRI findings. And then in another study, we want to say, okay, now I see this activation, so this must be executive function. And that's actually a very dangerous thing to do. It's not so straightforward, especially because there are whole networks involved. Okay, so here is how it looks at the Rubik Center. So the subject needs to lie down, and there is a mirror over top of their head, and they are looking back at the image that is presented from behind the wall through an opening on the monitor there. So obviously it's hard to do search. Okay, so as you could see from the design of this task, it was kind of simulated search. Imagine you have this task, this question, and now look at these documents as if they were results returned by a search engine, and tell us if you think they are relevant or not relevant in a sense of answering questions or not. Okay, yeah, this shows actually what happens with the information. So the general kind of hypothesis here were that there are different brain regions activated between these two different tasks, the word search and the information search, and that judging relevant, partially relevant, or irrelevant information also will differ in terms of the brain regions that are activated. But it was really hard to have very specific hypotheses in terms of, okay, we suppose that this specific region or another will be activated in this. Even though we could, I would say, kind of speculate that based on what we know from decision making and what kind of brain regions people discovered there, similar brain regions may be involved in decision making in terms of judging relevance. Okay, so what was done, I will go over this quickly. I'm kind of zooming into the final finding here. We can always talk about the technical details later, because I have three more things that I want to share with you. So this is kind of the main model, and that is to say that at the end of presentation of each, the main interest was to see the hemodynamic response, that is the brain change in brain activity, after the judgment was performed. Which means that we took 6 seconds of fMRI signal after the end of being exposed and responding to the stimulus. And this was 20 seconds maximum, like I said. People could respond sooner by pressing a button that they hold in a hand. There was pre-processing done as appropriate. Okay, so let's go now to analysis. So there were, what is often done is there are analysis done at 2 levels. First is individual level, so look at the data from each individual subject. And to do this, we are fitting essentially the model, into our model we are fitting the signal from fMRI. Just put it rather simply. So we are looking to, fit in this kind of square wave, we are fitting all the signals from fMRI. Because these are parts that are of our interest. And okay, let's move to the second level. And then once we have all the information from first level, from individual data, what's typically done is we aggregate it and we look at the group response, because we really want to find patterns of changes in brain activations that are common across a number of people, not just specific to one person, even though those may be also of interest. So here, general linear modeling was performed as well as t-tests. And the factors were our 2 tasks in one analysis, and then also the 2 main factors were actually I'm repeating myself. The 2 tasks, and one had 1 level, the other task had the 3 levels of document relevance. And at this stage there is a clustering of voxels, which are like groups of 3D groups of neurons. So essentially, in a sense, we can imagine them as, they're represented by 1 number at each point in time. At each point in time is every 2 seconds. No, 2 seconds. Every so often, I think the cycle was 2 seconds. It comes a new data point from which means a new picture from the machine. And I use 2 different clusters just to see, with less restrictive and more restrictive clustering, what will be the difference in clusters that are obtained. And so for looking at the difference between the tasks, IS versus WS, there was a difference looking at in a direction from information search to, and essentially subtracting the activity that was present in the word search tasks. Okay. Doing it the other way, it was found to be not significant. And I essentially only want to stop at this, just signaling that there was a difference that, as we expected there to be. For the 3 levels of relevance and looking just on the information search tasks, so looking at first ANOVA with repeated measures, and we have here 1 factor with 3 levels. There was overall difference at the less the first kind of clustering, which was less stringent. Okay, and one of the regions, I think it was all in the middle frontal gyrus, and one of the regions that was specifically I'm highlighting here is superior frontal gyrus, and I will mention why I highlighted a little bit later. Now, after this, so since there was some significance there, each pairwise comparison was performed with individual contrasts. And so overall, there was a difference between judging relevant and topical. relevant and irrelevant, but there was no difference between topical and irrelevant. And that's actually somewhat expected, because expectation was that people should judge topical documents as not relevant, because they didn't contain, in a sense of posed questions, they didn't contain the answer. So in this sense, the processing of the, in terms of how it's expressed in brain activations, was similar. So yeah, this is relevant and topical, showing which areas were found to be different in terms of activations between these two conditions. That's relevant and irrelevant. And here again, I would say the most interesting thing is after the clustering the threshold was more stringent, there was still this one region left. And again, this is in middle frontal gyrus, and the superior frontal gyrus also repeats there. Okay, so this is summary from this. And so overall, there was a pattern of differences in between the tasks. In terms of significant differences, looking within the information search task, with less restrictive, there was a difference between relevant, topical, and relevant, irrelevant. And for more restrictive clustering, there was a difference only between relevant and irrelevant. Okay, and why it is actually interesting to notice that the superior frontal gyrus was seemed to be there where the difference was. Is that in another work by Moshfeghi, Laura Pinto, Polik, and Roman Joret from Glasgow, they did a similar study using images. And one of the regions they found was also the same region, the difference between relevant and irrelevant. They also found some other regions, but this one was also there. So I think there's probably something interesting there. So let me now switch gears to eye tracking and EEG, and still looking at kind of similar questions, so questions about what are the differences between how people read, react, or in brain activations between when the interaction with relevant and not relevant information. So it's the same design, but a different data collection. The data collection done in the room back there, and also with Dr. Cole being involved. Some of it has been published last year. So, quickly zooming in. So I know that many people here are familiar with eye trackers, so I'm not going to do much of the introduction of this NP modality. However, I want to do a short digression, which I'm sure you appreciate in terms of history. So what were the first eye trackers like? So we are looking at 1898, thereabout. And what was then done is that there was a kind of like a suction cup with a mechanical lever, and it was to this revolving cylinder attached. And yes, just imagine IRB allowed to use cocaine to desynthesize reactions of this. But what's interesting is that the first studies that they did were about reading. So what you see here is actually the pattern of reading. The bright spots is where there was more movement of the lever, is where people fixated on words. And then in what the small dots is simply a saccadic movement between the points. Okay. So now it's much easier, even though still eye trackers are funky, it's not always so clear, and they break down.
How many you broke down? How a dozen of them.
So we're looking at the reflections in eyes, and this gives us with current cameras, infrared cameras, and image processing techniques, quite good location, reasonably accurate in terms of where a person is looking, not only on screen but also in the world out there. So this is it's kind of washed out, but these are glasses, wearable eye tracker from Toby. So some of the questions here were is the difference in terms of how documents are read between relevant and not relevant documents. Is there association between relevance, processing relevant documents and cognitive effort invested in reading it? So this will be also as expressed in eye tracking measures. And could we use some machine learning informed techniques to infer relevance documents from eye tracking data? So the variables here, kind of the dependent variables were similar as before, and I highlighted here perceived relevance. So this is according to participant response, because I'm focusing more on this, and I think it's the judgment of document usefulness is in the eye of the beholder. So that's why I think, especially if we are using NP method, it's more important, more appropriate to use this kind of notion of relevance / usefulness. And then number of metrics coming from eye trackers, and just very simple, time on a document till the decision was made. And I highlighted this because I'm going to explain the reading state, and there's also work done here with Michael with a two-state reading model. So the idea is that we read in different ways, and one view on reading that we could divide it into reading in continuous lines, and then periods of just scanning selectively some elements of text, but not reading continuously. Okay, so what was used in this data analysis were the probabilities of transitions between the states, as well as some measures related to how long people are in each state, how many fixations, what is the total duration of fixation in each state. So this is just kind of checking if the task was well performed by people and understood by them. So in terms of accuracy of responses. So expectation was that they respond, they judge all relevant document as relevant, so they press yes button, and topical and irrelevant documents, they respond with no button. Okay? So overall, the accuracy was 91%, 91.1. So that's pretty good. And I think we would say that we are happy with this. Okay, so now I want to show you some examples of what happens. So you see a scan path in a very simple image that shows you a scan path reading one of the documents. Okay, this one is pretty short. Here's the next one, and this is all on the same question. Okay, so for the same task. So here you see that they read pretty much, they cover the whole text, and then go back. And then here's the third example. And then they decided this one. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, there's 3 times combinations. So I'm going to ask you, let's take the last one, the last one that you have seen. How many people think this was reading a relevant document? All right.
Hey, you have a conflict of interest.
You don't know how many times I read those stories. I gotta tell you.
I guess I'll vote for that one too, since
Okay.
Probably a
He
foolish
knows
move.
betting rules.
Probably a foolish move.
How many would say that this was a topical document? You are not allowed to vote twice. So I think it's more like
Can't vote
7.
Well, if it's relevant,
More than
it's
50%
also
now,
topical.
And irrelevant.
Are these
Irrelevant, nobody. So there's
mutually
some-
exclusive categories? Are these exclusive categories?
They
Maybe
are-
more than one
The
category.
relevant topical could be the same.
That's what Michael's saying.
Or
Well,
topical and irrelevant.
topical, okay, wording. It's partially relevant. Okay, that's.
The relevance here is measured by it being on topic.
No,
Does it,
no.
does it have this specific?
Whether
Yeah.
whether it
Well,
answered the question they were
So
asking.
there are two notions. So these actually are based on judgments by track judges. Okay, that's what I'm displaying here. But the relevance measurement of interest to us is based on judgment of participants as and defined by the document containing answer to a question.
Mhm.
So, well, here it is. I should have chocolates and less. I will use this moment to have some water. So, you know, it's an example of these patterns, but what's interesting, they are quite different. And this difference is also can be measured in the features that are extracted from eye tracking. And so when we look at the transition probabilities, the relevant and partially relevant, they tend to be read, whereas irrelevant tend to be scanned. And it's really hard to say how people know pretty early on that they really just start scanning these documents. And I had some other data sets that I collected later, and it's kind of very similar thing that happens. There are also individual differences, but this is kind of by and large what happens on the average, so to say. Now, looking at some more variables and patterns, this essentially is showing, you know, not the specific values, but just patterns of these values. So in most cases, the largest value was for partially relevant or topical documents, except for two measures. So these measures were the values were largest on topical, were like reaction time, reading speed, in pixels, in words, which was actually in words was not significant, number of words that were fixated upon, number of fixations on words, and proportion of words fixated upon. So they, yes.
Yeah, can you explain a bit about how those variables are indicative of cognitive effort? Or what is meant by cognitive effort?
Well, cognitive effort is meant here in a sense of, or the assumption is made that the more, essentially, that it's somewhat equated with time it takes for processing all individual words before a decision is made, okay? And so it's a sum of durations of fixations. It's also, the first measure is, you know, this is very simple reaction time. So how much time in total, without regarding all the fixation duration, but how much time it takes to decide. And you know, there is a number of prior work where these measures, and I can see Michael is waving, are considered to be reflective of cognitive effort involved in reading.
Yeah, just a comment. When people fixate, they fixate until they acquire the meaning of the word. So they don't saccade until they already know what that word means. So just by adding up
Yeah.
the fixation times, you have some measure of the cognitive processing that's taking place.
And if there are more difficult words, this is a, you know, a specific additional. So there's kind of internal reason why it takes longer to process a word, There is also more difficult word because it's perhaps not so frequently used. And there's issues with familiarity, but overall it's the indication of the effort. And the two that I highlighted in kind of the bluish or sea bluish color, they are kind of the longest reading sequential measures and the longest fixation overall in reading sequences. And the pattern here is somewhat different, and on the relevant documents, they tended to be the longest. So the interpretation, which I'm showing kind of here, again, is kind of conceptual, not reflecting the actual values, is that the cognitive effort was highest on partially relevant, and the maximum cognitive effort was highest on the relevant documents. And that may be because looking at various patterns of reading, people were actually making sure and kind of coming back even again to the relevant words to check if it was the what they were looking for. Another measure that is very interesting is pupil dilation. So pupil is controlled by autonomic nervous system, and it reflects a number of different cognitive and affective phenomena. So our pupils react to light. Okay, if we kind of control for this, beyond this, it starts to be interesting. If I were to summarize it just as a one kind of phenomena, our pupils dilate when we pay more attention. And we pay more attention because something is more difficult for us to understand. That's one possibility. We pay more attention because we have some kind of affective state. So when we look at our loved ones, usually our pupils tend to dilate. Maybe that's the first encounter, I know. I will not comment further on this, but one of the aspects is the cognitive load. There are even frameworks and algorithms that are ready-made for detecting cognitive load by measuring pupil, and that's why I use it here. I'm using a relative pupil change in diameter, so that for each person it is normalized to the average pupil size for this person in a study. And so here, let me just quickly guide you through this. So I still keep using the two relevance. So the first relevance is in a sense of track judges, the relevant, partially relevant or topical, and irrelevant, and the perceived relevance is according to how people judge. For the overall on text stimuli, for looking at the aggregated measures using this relative pupil diameter, it's about 2% of change between these. So 2% from irrelevant to relevant, and kind of topical somewhere in the middle. And this is for both types of notions of relevance. So it's significant, but it's not okay. And it makes sense actually to ask what happens just before the decision is made. Okay, so taking just 1 second before the decision is made, you can see that the difference is larger, and it's about 3% difference between irrelevant and relevant. Okay, I think this starts to be then more interesting, and it's an indication that these measures can be used potentially to classify documents. And that was an attempt, and I'm calling it an attempt because it was using relatively simple classification methods using decision trees in WECA. So this is binary classification, and so the best classification was achieved using all the eye tracking measures and reaction time, and it was 74% accuracy, which I think it's not too bad because there was nothing really very fancy down here. It was just relatively simple feature selection and simple algorithm. Now, taking only pupil in this 1 second before the decision, so using one feature in these algorithms is maybe not so. I don't know. Usually it makes sense to do a lot of features. I think that's my sense how they best work. But even then, with this one feature, it's 67% accuracy. So overall, it seems that the results indicate that the documents at different levels of relevance are read differently. The cognitive effort, in a sense of effort invested in reading, expressed by the eye tracking measures, is also different between these the relevant levels of relevance. And using these classification results, it's also indicative of possibility of inferring relevance from eye movement, especially from pupil dilation. And some limitations. This is only one type of text, so static texts, relatively limited, and one type of search task. So moving on, and I was told I have 50 minutes. What time did I start? I still have two things. I want to
5 minutes past 12.
Okay, so let's continue. It's essentially the same experiment, but what I have not highlighted, just it was up there, is that it also included EEG. And so now the data analysis will be done within, the focus is on within stimulus. So what happens in a course of time, okay? And so a few words about EEG. So it captures signal at the skull, which are related to neural activity in cortex. It has excellent temporal resolution. It's not good at identifying location. However, with high density EEG, you can do kind of using inverse calculation of inverse dipoles and get at locations. Roughly, some people are very good at it. But you really need to have very sophisticated and very high density EEG to do this. Like with many of these methods, dealing with signals, requires experience. There are many so-called artifacts. There is noise from power lines. There is noise from other neurons that, for example, when we move our eyes, some neurons are firing to do this, and this also may be captured by EEG. And it's noise for most purposes. Most often, there are two types of analysis. So one type is looking at a signal and doing some kind of frequency phase analysis. And you probably have heard about alpha, theta, beta, delta waves. And so there's a lot of work that shows that the proportion of activity between different waves changes, for example, as a function of different cognitive loads. So the proportion of alpha and theta specifically, alpha goes down, theta goes up. This way? When there's more cognitive load imposed on a person. The other type of analysis is event-rated potential. So that's done such that there is something that occurs that is shown to a person, or it could be also auditory information. And we look at the signals that are locked in time at the onset of this new stimulus. And it's typically done across many trials, many people. We get a clean wave, and this shows some response. The most famous one is P300, which is kind of a surprise signal. When something is surprising, unexpected, there is a positive signal in brain waves about 300 milliseconds after this surprising event occurs. And there are many other similar signals that were found, for example, in neurolinguistics that are related to processing unknown words or so the surprising factor here is translated into incongruence, so something that should not be there, perhaps is not coherent sentence. Incoherent.
Oh.
Incoherent. Right. So, and there are many cognitive affective phenomena with which differences in EEG obtained signals were found, including cognitive load already mentioned, also attention management, engagement, and meditation, just to name a few. And again, we have a somewhat brighter screen, so it's somewhat washed out. The device that we used here was the low-cost emotive Epoch neuro headset that has 14 channels. Half of them roughly are kind of prefrontal, frontal cortex, so they are here. There are some at occipital and parietal, but there's really very bad coverage at the central line. And it's wireless. So, some people doubt at it, but I actually have had with some other colleagues recently finally accepted publication to a journal where we show differences on a very simple NBAC task. You may recall the NBAC task. That it indicated differences in the signals from the device were well correlated, again using mostly actually classifications, with the levels of difficulty in NBAC task. So this is cheap. There are much more expensive, and by this I mean $10,000, $50,000, maybe $100,000 EEG, usually in the form of a cap or some kind of a net that is put on a person's head. You need to put gel to get good contact. It's messy, but it can give you then good signal. So it's a trade-off between using something simple that some places may not want you to publish it because they don't believe in the data, to something very sophisticated. Okay, so questions here, research questions. So again, it's somewhat similar question in terms of inferring document relevance from EEG signals, perhaps in combination with eye tracking or alone. And this is also, I mentioned something about the whole document level, but the focus of what I'm going to say now is in the course of reading a document, not the whole data from each text stimulus. And so this is expressed in the second question. Do these signals differ between the early, middle, late stages of reading and separately during reading relevant words? Features, I'm going to zoom through them. So using some of the eye tracking derived variables that I already showed here, there's a number of additional features created. Some are just some statistical variations such as mean, median values calculated. Also moving average of pupil size, and also including some percentiles of their values. And some other stuff I have already shown in previous, when I was talking about the previous data analysis. What's new here is distance. No, I think this is kind of what was there also. And in terms of the EEG, that were 50 EEG features extracted. So a number of different things. Some of them were just, let's try to see, put them all in, and let algorithm select the best features, and then see if we get good classification. Some of them are selected based on, they're selected as grounded, such that we know that, for example, cognitive load is associated with changes in power spectrum of certain frequency bands of EEG signal. So here is the specific algorithm that were used, minimum redundancy, maximum relevance for the feature selection, and the proximal support vector machines for the classification, so variation of the SVM algorithm. So here, let me show how the data was segmented. What I'm showing you here is also replaying one case where the beginning, kind of the middle, the end, and the reading of relevant words are color-coded. So the green is the first, roughly the first second, I think. This kind of, everything else is kind of yellowish, and in the middle of reading is somewhere here. And then reading relevant words is kind of dark pink and red, and the very end is blue, which is also matched here with this, here where I'm showing visually how the data was cut from how the segments were selected from the overall signals that were collected while a person was reading a given text document. The last 200 milliseconds were discarded because that they may include activity that is related to motor actions. So people were pressing on a button. So we didn't use this part of the data. And then we looked at what happens. Well, what happens? Kind of can we see the difference between the relevant and irrelevant, reading relevant and irrelevant documents, in a sense of is classification working differently for the beginning of data on irrelevant and relevant documents? Is the classification working differently in the middle, at the end, and also is it working differently for relevant and everything else? So reading relevant words on a relevant document. So the classification accuracy was essentially taken as a measure of similarity of based on the features that were taken from EEG and from eye tracking. Okay. Just to show you that there were many numbers, many more numbers that we got from it. So I'm going to highlight only the best cases and also the most interesting cases, so not necessarily the best in terms of the classification accuracy. Before I do this, let me actually say that I'm also showing, and some people are saying that this measure may be more, maybe better to use, it's more reflective of what's of the performance of classification. That's area under curve, okay? And I'm also showing accuracy. And here, this is binary, again, binary classification, so by chance you are getting 50%, so 0.5 is if you expect some, for some random process, that's what roughly you should be getting. So two parts here. So one part is to look at what happens when we compare classification performance at the beginning, the middle, at the end of each trial, of each reading of a text stimulus, and comparing what happens with EEG and with eye tracking data features. With EEG, it's actually pretty bad, you could say. It gets more interesting with eye tracking. And I think what's really interesting is if we compare between the two. So the interpretation is that there is not much difference in terms of EEG signals between the beginning, the reading in the middle, and the end of a document. However, there is a difference. So there is something different in how people read as expressed in fixation duration, etc., and pupil size between the beginning and the end, the middle and the end of documents. Now looking at the other data segment and comparing with everything else, so looking at only fixations in the data segment where the reading sequence was contained with fixations on relevant words, okay, just words. So just cutting this small portion of data. We see that EEG alone is actually not having such a bad performance because the around 0.7678 for the AUC and kind of 0.75 for accuracy. That's pretty good, I think. Now with eye tracking, it's actually the best result that was obtained here in terms of classification was looking at eye tracking measures just for 1 second of data where people are reading the relevant words, and this is shown here. And if we added also EEG to this, there was some improvement, but not really a lot. So overall, if we were to take both and kind of consider how EEG is contributing to the classification, for the best eye classifications, such as here, is only contributing 1-2%, not a lot. For other cases where eye classification was performing not so well, the contribution of EEG was 5 to 7%. So I'm trying now to illustrate some of these visually. So the difference in terms of performance of classification for eye tracking between the beginning, middle, and end, we can show as the differences between these two kind of hypothetical variables that are kind of conceptual combination of eye tracking features. Is that initially there is no difference in reading between irrelevant and irrelevant documents, that at some point it starts to differ, and then at the end it differs the most. Now looking at the what happens in terms of the classification performance at the reading relevant words compared to everything else. So this was where the relatively good performance for EEG was found, and where also the best performance for eye tracking was found. So the features from this data segment were different from all other data segments. Okay, so I think that there are some interesting things there, but it's all on text documents which are static text stimuli. So can we find something similar on web search? So I want to highlight some results from a more recent study, which was done about a year ago, and I have some initial results from it published at CIGIR in a short paper / poster. So the design here is slightly, there's a new design, 4 tasks, 2 levels of complexity. 5 more minutes. Okay, yeah. I want to get to some conclusions. So the search was done on Wikipedia using a commercial search engine, but not very well known, searchtechnology.com. And the notion of relevance was here actually based on judgments performed by people. And the way they perform judgments, they bookmarked and annotated web pages that were related to the search. Okay? Yeah, I'm not going to show you the tasks. I can show you them later if you're interested. So, the questions are, kind of similar research questions. Hypothesis that the pupil dilation eye tracking measures will differ between relevant and irrelevant, and so on. What's new here is that I also look at the difference between first visits and revisits of web pages, and also between visits to relevant pages and visits to relevant pages when actually the relevant judgment was made. The measures are almost the same, except here there is also saccade length, so what happens in between fixations. Well, it kind of was as a distance earlier, but what's new is the saccade angle. So at which angle our eyes are moving from after we are done with reading a given word. So this is how the types of web page visits were defined. So there was first and subsequent visits to irrelevant pages, relevant pages, and there was a separate category which was visit to relevant pages when the relevant judgment was actually made. This is a pattern for pairwise comparisons where there were significant differences. I am going to highlight some of them that were more interesting, which should be on the next slide, and especially focusing on pupil dilation. So overall, pupil dilated more on visit to relevant pages. And that's very similar results to what I showed you earlier. And pupil dilation actually didn't differentiate between revisits to pages and relevance judgments on relevance pages. However, just looking at the 2 seconds before the relevance judgment, there was a difference. So taking only the data segment of 2 seconds before the judgment, there was a difference, and we could tell that this is a visit when actually a relevance judgment is made on this web page. There was also a simple classification down here, again, binary classification using flexible discriminant analysis and to maximize the reciprocal, no, the ROC. The accuracy, so I'm not showing the AUC, I'm showing the accuracy. The accuracy is not so stunningly good as it was in some of from some of the data on static text. But there's lots of noise on web pages. There's a lot of different things that happens. There's not only text, there are images, there are other things that people do, people navigate. So I think it's still not so bad. And looking at what was the most important variable is the relative pupil dilation. So one thing I'm doing, I'm looking more closely, kind of looking at better methods of classification, and also pulling out only the parts where people were reading text on these web pages. So I'm getting close to 30 seconds or something. I want to mention a couple of ongoing projects. So one project that actually started a couple years ago is I'm working with people from University of Maryland. This was initially funded by Lockheed Martin, and we want to get at inferring relevance levels at the word level. And we are using EEG, using a clinical grade 32-channel device and a decent eye tracker. And then we're looking at EFRPs, eye fixation related potentials that are related to fixations on words, especially before a relevant decisions are made. And some other things, so not just focusing on information relevance as a concept that allows us to gain better understanding of what's happening in information search process. I'm also looking at learning, I'm learning about search as learning, that's the name of the project, by considering essentially learning at the vocabulary level in the course of search tasks, where search tasks are designed to be relatively complex and taking longer, relatively longer time. So not 5 minutes, but more like half an hour to see the differences in eye tracking. And that's actually something that the idea came from some of the analysis that we done here on DKE data and the paper on inferring knowledge at levels of people. And another project, which I'm just kind of at the level of designing experiments, is to look at mindless information reading in information seeking.
Is that the final exam for it? Oh.
Okay, so
I love it.
in closing, I want to mention over time now, but I want to mention some of the aspects, some of the challenges that also define and drive future directions. Overall, there's lack of standardized measures, even though some of the measures, such as fixation durations and derived measures, repeat, and pupil dilation, there is many possible combinations here. And some people take approach, and also have done it occasionally, just take a kind of machine learning data mining approach. Let's put all the features inside the box and see what comes out. But I think a combined approach, so having some grounded reasons why we select some features together with applying machine learning, it's really more powerful. We are using all kinds of tasks, and it wouldn't be nice if we had some standardized task and could characterize them by having a related set of NP responses on different NP measures. So for more complex tasks, for tasks of different task facets, what kind of NP responses we get, and Michael's work and some earlier work that you and we've done here is kind of some step in this direction, using the eye tracking data. No baseline data largely. This is one of the big problems. A lot of this data is very idiosyncratic, so you have to kind of calibrate for each person. And some of this is, I think, kind of obvious. It's still worth doing. So hopefully in few years we'll have a well agreed upon set of standard tasks or standard tasks, at least characterized with some tasks characterized with some well established facets to which we find a standard set of NP responses from different devices. Some other possibilities that are used are galvanic skin response, heart rate variability that I haven't mentioned here. And so that we could kind of use these standard responses as kind of markers of what is going on in the search process. And this image is from the upcoming paper at CHIR, the Perspectives paper with Javed Mostafa. All right, thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks. Just one thing. I'm thinking of this project that Nina and I are working on. So you're doing this basic science on this, but I can see applications for because we're trying to come up with reliable ways for people to indicate how complicated it was to assess something. And this would be great rather than just taking their verbal report
Right,
for doing
absolutely.
that. But one kind of question I had is, you talked about news stories. I was just curious because it's very interesting. So I'm trying to like push forward and understanding further. Is that news stories have this kind of genre style? Is there an interaction at all between sort of eye behavior and the actual nature of the artifact, such as the genre style and how it's written? Or
Yes.
is that, what do people know
And
about
I'm laughing because I asked kind of similar question yesterday. So I think overall the answer is yes. One perhaps part of defense here is that there are some features of eye movement patterns that are kind of general, I would say,
Independent of, yeah.
and independent of specific content. But I think it's also fair to say that we can say this, but we should say that, well, but we don't really know the whole extent of different interactions, right? So, there's lots of work on eye movement and reading done by psychologists. Most of it, well, first it was done at the level of word, or the word was moved, or some other tricks were done so that we could see how people read. Then at the level of sentence, and there is really, really very few works on kind of more open reading and looking at what exactly is happening. I mean, there is work more at the level of sections of text, but not really looking more closely how people read different genre or different types of documents, and then, let alone how people read different things on the web.
Just thinking how those cues might relate to judgments of relevance. Sort of
Yeah,
thing.
that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Jingen, you found that dwell time as decision time, that is, how long a person looked at a document before they decided whether it was irrelevant or not, okay, or in between. That the decision time for relevance changed as a function of the search, how much experience the person had had searching on this topic. That is, session 1 search, session 2 search, session 3 search, which corresponded with and was more accurately predicted with increase in subject knowledge, topic knowledge, right? So by the third point, deciding whether something was relevant, took as little time as deciding whether something was irrelevant. Okay. Now, yeah. Okay. So you haven't had a chance to look at this with
Right.
with your stuff yet.
Yeah.
But it suggests that it may not, that one at the very least would have to take account of the person's topic knowledge, I
Yeah.
think, in
Yeah.
Yeah.
in interpreting perhaps these other measures as well.
Yeah, yes, agreed.
So to follow on to that, coming back to the original experiment looking at relevant, topical, and irrelevant, one way to think about at least some of those results were asked the same questions when you were looking at the cognitive effort, is the decision bounds and how well people understood that.
So what could you?
Well, if one took, for example, very familiar topics that people write over the range of the data that we had, some of those topics were more along the lines of general knowledge, and some of it was,
Yeah.
really pretty specific. And I don't know if one could get enough power in the analysis, but you might be able to split it along those lines.
So with this, the quaint data set, and this was just a small subset of the whole set, I think most of
They're all late 90s
relatively,
stories.
relatively unfamiliar to people. I mean, familiar is a general topic, but not necessarily specifics, like what happened or who was it or.
Yeah.
But I agree. It is important to have some assessment. And in one of the current studies, that what I mentioned, the searching as learning, is I am, and I would say, attempting to measure their knowledge before and after. And I went through many different possible things how to do this, and it's very hard to do, especially that I don't want also to. I don't want to cue them, or I don't want to I don't want that the learning happens at the point of measurement. So I don't want to show them any, like, even questions. I want to get their kind of dump. So I'm asking them actually to list concepts before and after. That was final thing I decided on.
So, yes, very interesting. I'm wondering too about other kind of confounding variables, which I'm sure you have. This is very controlled, right, what you're doing.
Yeah.
Everyone has the same task, they have the same time constraints and so forth. So that when we have different time constraints, when we have different tasks, complexity and so forth. I've just been spending yesterday reviewing grant proposals on deadline. So 22 of them. I have 3 more left. Last night my eyes were like going like this because it's all online. And so, how we concentrate and look and read things, even when we're making big decisions like awarding grants, right, has a lot to do with some of these other variables. So I just wonder how you might think about that for, and the other thing too is the participants themselves. So age, age range and those kinds of things too.
So age range mostly here is relatively homogeneous. It's typically college age students, sometimes graduate students. Actually, speaking about familiarity with topic, in one of these studies, I thought in EG done here, there was a question about familiarity, so self-rating, just a simple scale. And time pressure and different types of reading, that's all important. I mean, so here, in the constrained conditions and with the same task, I think we control for some of these factors. It's definitely interesting to learn and explore more what happens when we change things on other dimensions. One other factor is that, is this your task or somebody asked you to do it and give you $20 or so? and so
or imposed it, is making you do something for whatever reason.
Yeah. So in the current study with learning, actually one task is self-generated. and I will see what happens with that. I mean, that's actually the first time that I'm using a self-generated task.
The future work.
Future work.
I could tell you're reviewing proposals.
Implications, significant
Social
implications. Future directions.
Yeah, I mean, I would, one other kind of summary here is that this is just the tip of the iceberg. I think there's so many things that could be done, and could be, give us a very powerful information. And so we just at SIGIR, I co-organized workshop on Neuro-IR, and it was actually quite big interest. I was surprised that many people came, many important people in the field came. That's how I would also summarize this, which is a good indication.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
Other questions, comments?
I was thinking fatigue too. These things I'm reviewing, they're 20 to 25 pages each.
Yeah.
So at some point, there's that fatigue,
Yeah.
so when you have a concentrated amount of concentrated amount of concentration on online documents, or say web browsing, for example, that might have an impact as
It
well.
would be nice, but then there are also all these privacy and content issues. Like find subjects like on your task, what you were doing, and ask people like you to capture the data. But then if you want to capture the content, it probably gets very tricky. But yeah,
But you could do the patterns, but not the content.
yeah. So the
You
patterns,
could,
right?
You could save the patterns.
But then you would need to have some information about the content, at least some metadata about the content. But yeah, that's it. I think it's an interesting point to think about. Finding tasks like this, and then finding participants, maybe less sensitive information.
We do a lot of things like this, I would say, because we're going to be reviewing applications from students. We're reviewing faculty search applications. There's a lot of processes like that are time-bound, that have an enormous impact, that also have an enormous amount of importance to that particular person, which is another kind of a factor. I mean, beyond relevance, it might be an imposed task, grading papers, right? It's sort of like an intensely concentrated task with a time bound at the end of the semester, so forth.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just an interesting thing.
So I mean, part of the
Variable.
motivation behind the project with Lockheed Martin, and Marlon was, Lockheed Martin thinks about the intelligence journalists, and the idea is that this will feed into some kind of algorithm that will proactively bring new documents based on how people read them and what are their signals, brain signals.
Actually, more like a comment/request for more information. You talked about the image part, because I can see the applications of this, as you said, multiple dimensions.
Yes.
So, what have people done in the more multimodal understanding of?
So there was the work that I mentioned that was published in ECIR in 2013. That was judging images. I don't remember the set from which they took them, but it was some kind of publicly available and also by other people image set where it was judged by, it was the relevant judgment. The same group, is a student from this group, it's Luisa Pinto. Her dissertation in progress is on video. So judging, and I'm not sure what's the granularity level, it may be judging some segments, if not scenes. And that's fMRI. So people are watching some video snippets lying down in the machine. And there is some other work. So people actually, this group, so Jomon Jose, or Jose is it? His group also looked at images in some other contexts and also at some affective aspects.
Okay. Gotcha. Thank you very much.